Sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one everyone mistakes for the weakest. The lunch hall inside Grayson State Penitentiary fell silent for just a heartbeat as the newest inmate stepped through the serving line, carrying a plastic tray with both hands. Isaiah Grant looked older than most of the men around him, his close-cropped hair already showing streaks of gray, his broad shoulders hidden beneath a plain prison uniform that seemed slightly too large, and his calm expression revealing nothing except quiet patience. He neither searched for trouble nor avoided eye contact. He simply walked toward an empty table as though he had already accepted whatever the day intended to bring. That was exactly when Cole Barrett decided to make an example of him. Every inmate in Grayson knew Cole. Tall, confident, and surrounded by loyal followers, the white gang leader had ruled the housing unit for years without needing to raise his voice very often. A laugh from Cole usually meant someone else would spend the rest of the day wishing they had never entered the room. New arrivals always attracted his attention because fear spread quickly, and fear was the easiest currency to collect behind concrete walls. Cole leaned back in his chair, smiled toward his crew, and slowly stood. Conversations faded across the cafeteria. Plastic forks stopped moving. Even inmates who claimed never to pay attention quietly glanced toward the center aisle. They had seen this ritual countless times before. Cole walked directly into Isaiah's path and lightly tapped the edge of the food tray with one finger. "Wrong direction," he said with a smile that carried more confidence than humor. Isaiah stopped without speaking. Cole looked around the room, making certain every pair of eyes had found him before continuing. "Around here, new people earn the right to eat." A few nervous chuckles drifted through the cafeteria. Isaiah remained still. His breathing never changed. Cole gently pushed the tray downward until several pieces of bread slid onto the polished floor. "Pick it up," he said. No one moved. A correctional officer watched from across the room, but made no effort to interfere. The exchange appeared harmless enough. Just another moment of prison intimidation that rarely found its way into an official report. Cole folded his arms, waiting. Slowly, Isaiah lowered himself toward the floor. Several inmates exchanged disappointed looks. They had expected resistance, an argument, or at least visible anger. Instead, the new inmate quietly gathered the fallen bread one piece at a time without complaining. Cole smiled wider, convinced he had correctly judged the man standing before him. But as Isaiah reached for the final piece, he briefly lifted his eyes toward the security camera mounted high above the cafeteria entrance. The glance lasted less than a second. Then he smiled. It was not the smile of someone defeated. It was the calm expression of a man who had just confirmed something important. Cole noticed it immediately. "You think something is funny?" he asked. Isaiah rose to his feet, balanced the tray again, and looked directly at Cole for the first time. His voice remained soft enough that only the nearest tables could hear. "Everyone eventually makes one mistake too many." Cole laughed loudly, encouraging everyone else to laugh with him, but several older inmates remained silent. There was something unusual about the new man's eyes. They did not carry fear, resentment, or desperation. They carried patience. Cole stepped aside with an exaggerated bow, allowing Isaiah to continue toward the empty table. "Enjoy your lunch while you still can," he called after him. Isaiah nodded politely without turning around. Across the cafeteria, Correctional Officer Daniel Brooks watched the entire exchange from beside the serving counter. Unlike many others, he was less interested in Cole's performance than in Isaiah's reaction. Most new inmates arrived tense, angry, or frightened. This man had behaved as though he had expected every second of what had just happened. Daniel glanced at the security monitor displaying the cafeteria cameras. Isaiah had looked directly into one lens before smiling. It was too deliberate to be accidental. As the lunch period continued, Cole celebrated another easy victory with his followers, completely unaware that the man he believed he had broken had quietly begun observing every face, every conversation, every seat at every table, and every camera watching from above, because Isaiah Grant had entered Grayson State Penitentiary carrying far more than a prison sentence. And the promise he intended to keep would not begin with a fight, but with patience. By the time the afternoon count ended, the story of the new inmate had already spread through every housing unit inside Grayson State Penitentiary. Most men repeated the same version. The quiet newcomer had surrendered without protest, picked food off the floor, and walked away while the white gang leader laughed in front of the entire cafeteria. In prison, reputations often formed faster than friendships, and Isaiah Grant had apparently earned his within a single lunch period. Yet not everyone accepted the obvious explanation. Correctional Officer Daniel Brooks replayed the cafeteria security footage twice before finishing his shift report. The confrontation itself appeared ordinary, but Isaiah's brief glance toward the ceiling camera continued bothering him. It was too deliberate to belong to someone overwhelmed by fear. Daniel enlarged the recording and watched again. The exact moment Cole Barrett forced the bread onto the floor, Isaiah had quietly positioned himself where two cameras captured the entire exchange from different angles. Then, before standing, he looked directly into one lens with a calm smile that almost resembled silent confirmation. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Either the new inmate possessed remarkable self-control, or he had intentionally allowed the humiliation to happen. Meanwhile, Isaiah returned to his assigned cell carrying only a thin mattress, several state-issued blankets, and a small cardboard box containing his personal property. Another inmate, an older mechanic named Leonard Hayes, occupied the lower bunk. Leonard studied the newcomer for several seconds before speaking. "You made today harder than it needed to be." Isaiah carefully folded his blanket. "Did I?" Leonard sighed. "Cole only respects people who fight back." Isaiah smiled faintly without looking up. "Some people mistake resistance for strength." Leonard frowned. "Then what is strength?" Isaiah tucked the blanket neatly beneath the mattress corners before answering. Knowing exactly when not to react. Leonard stared at him, uncertain whether the answer came from wisdom or experience. During evening recreation, Isaiah walked alone around the concrete yard while dozens of inmates gathered in familiar groups. Cole and his followers occupied the basketball court, laughing loudly as though the events of lunch had already become another forgotten victory. Several inmates deliberately bumped shoulders with Isaiah while passing. Others whispered just loudly enough for him to hear. None of it changed his pace. He simply continued walking the perimeter, quietly observing everything around him. He noticed which cameras rotated every 30 seconds, which gates remained locked during shift changes, which correctional officers watched carefully, and which rarely lifted their eyes from paperwork. More importantly, he noticed something else. A young inmate no older than 20 was carrying laundry across the yard while avoiding every member of Cole's group. The young man never looked toward them directly, yet every few steps he glanced over his shoulder as though expecting trouble to find him at any moment. Isaiah remembered that expression. He had seen it years ago on frightened teenagers who believed surviving another day required becoming someone they never wanted to be. As the recreation period ended, Cole intercepted Isaiah near the entrance to the housing unit. "You walk around like you own the place," Cole said with a confident grin. Isaiah answered politely, "I am only learning the routine." Cole laughed. "Your routine belongs to me now." Several gang members surrounded them, expecting another easy display of dominance. Cole pointed toward a maintenance closet. "Tomorrow morning you clean that hallway. By yourself." Isaiah nodded once. "If that is where I am assigned." The answer caught Cole slightly off guard. There was no argument to enjoy and no anger to provoke. Only quiet acceptance that somehow felt impossible to control. After lights out, Daniel Brooks sat alone inside the administration office reviewing Isaiah's intake file. The folder contained little beyond sentencing documents, fingerprints, and medical evaluations. Yet one page had been partially redacted before arrival. Daniel requested the archive transfer record through the prison database, expecting another routine document. Instead, a notice appeared stating that portions of Isaiah Grant's previous employment history had been sealed by federal request. Daniel stared at the screen longer than he intended. Federal request was not language commonly attached to ordinary inmates. He closed the file, but found himself thinking less about what Isaiah had done before prison and more about what kind of man could remain completely unshaken while becoming the target of the most feared inmate inside Grayson. Across the dark housing unit, Isaiah lay awake on the top bunk listening to distant footsteps echo through concrete corridors. Hidden beneath his mattress rested a folded photograph worn soft with age. Before closing his eyes, he quietly looked at the smiling faces captured inside that picture and whispered a promise to himself that no one else could hear. Tomorrow, he knew, Cole Barrett would push even harder, And that was exactly what Isaiah had been patiently waiting for. Morning arrived with the same sharp whistle that echoed through Grayson State Penitentiary every day at precisely 6 o'clock. But for Isaiah Grant, the sound was simply another reminder that patience required discipline measured one decision at a time. He climbed quietly from the upper bunk, folded his blanket with practiced precision, and greeted Leonard Hayes with a polite nod before reporting for his assigned work detail. As Cole Barrett had promised, the hallway outside the maintenance storage room had been added to Isaiah's cleaning assignment. The extra work itself meant little. What mattered was who had arranged it. Cole stood several yards away with 3 members of his crew, leaning casually against the wall while pretending to supervise. Every inmate walking through the corridor understood the real purpose. This was not about keeping the prison clean. It was another public performance designed to remind everyone who controlled the housing unit. Isaiah filled a mop bucket, dipped the mop into the water, and began working without complaint. Several inmates slowed their pace to watch, expecting another confrontation. Instead, Isaiah concentrated on the polished concrete floor with the same calm focus he had shown in the cafeteria. His silence frustrated Cole more than open defiance ever could. "You missed a spot," Cole called loudly, pointing toward a section that had already been cleaned. Isaiah calmly returned and mopped the area again without argument. A few of Cole's followers laughed, but the laughter sounded less confident than it had the previous day. There was something unsettling about a man who refused to become angry no matter how often he was challenged. While the hallway gradually emptied, a nervous young inmate carrying folded uniforms accidentally stumbled near the wet floor. Before anyone else reacted, Isaiah reached out with one steady hand, helping the young man regain his balance without spilling the laundry. "Take your time," Isaiah said gently. The young inmate quietly thanked him before hurrying away. Cole watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He had expected humiliation, not kindness. "You making friends already?" he asked with a mocking smile. Isaiah wrung out the mop before answering. "Everyone deserves respect." Cole laughed. "Respect is earned." Isaiah looked at him calmly. "Sometimes it is given first." The simple reply drew unexpected silence from several nearby inmates. Even Leonard, sweeping farther down the corridor, paused for a brief moment before returning to work. Meanwhile, Correctional Officer Daniel Brooks continued searching for answers inside the Administrative Records Office. The sealed employment history still refused to open through the standard prison database, but one detail had captured his attention. Isaiah had completed every correctional program offered during his previous incarceration while receiving consistently outstanding behavioral evaluations. Even more unusual, every evaluation described him using nearly identical language. Exceptional leadership, reliable under pressure, de-escalates conflict. Daniel quietly repeated those words to himself. They did not resemble descriptions normally written about inmates adapting to prison life. Curious, he contacted a retired warden who had supervised Isaiah years earlier. The older man answered after several rings. Daniel introduced himself and carefully asked whether Isaiah Grant had been a disciplinary problem. The retired warden chuckled softly. "Quite the opposite," he replied. "He prevented more fights than my staff did." Daniel frowned. "How?" The answer came without hesitation. "He talked people down before situations got out of control. I have never met anyone who could calm angry men the way he could." Daniel thanked him, but before ending the call, the retired warden added one final sentence. "Whatever you think you know about Isaiah Grant, you probably only know half the story." Those words stayed with Daniel throughout the afternoon. Back inside the housing unit, Isaiah finally completed the hallway assignment. As he emptied the bucket, he noticed Cole speaking quietly with several followers near the recreation schedule posted on the wall. They occasionally glanced toward the same frightened young inmate from earlier. Isaiah recognized the pattern immediately. Someone vulnerable had become the next target. He said nothing, but his attention sharpened. During evening recreation, Isaiah deliberately walked the same route around the yard as before, quietly observing every movement. He noticed the young inmate sitting alone on a concrete bench, repeatedly looking toward the basketball court where Cole's group laughed together. Isaiah did not approach him. Instead, he sat on another bench several yards away, close enough that the young man would not feel completely alone if trouble found him. Across the yard, Cole noticed exactly where Isaiah had chosen to sit. A slow smile spread across his face. Until now, he had been testing the new inmate's pride. Tomorrow, he decided, he would test something far more dangerous. As the yard lights flickered on against the darkening Indiana sky, Isaiah looked toward the rotating security cameras one more time before quietly closing his eyes for a brief moment. The promise he carried had never been about protecting himself. It had always been about protecting someone else, and deep inside Grayson State Penitentiary, that moment was beginning to arrive. The following morning carried an unusual stillness that even the oldest inmates noticed without speaking about it. Grayson State Penitentiary followed routines with mechanical precision, yet every man understood that routines often hid intentions. Isaiah Grant sensed it the moment he stepped into the corridor. Conversations became quieter as he passed. Several inmates looked toward him and then immediately toward Cole Barrett, as though waiting for an invisible clock to strike the right moment. Cole appeared unusually cheerful, greeting people with relaxed confidence that felt carefully rehearsed. He no longer seemed interested in embarrassing Isaiah over small inconveniences. Instead, he behaved like a man setting the final pieces of a larger plan into place. Isaiah accepted his breakfast tray and sat alone near the same section of the dining hall where the security cameras overlapped. Leonard Hayes carried his own tray across the room before quietly taking the seat opposite him. For nearly a minute, neither man spoke. Finally, Leonard lowered his voice. "You keep choosing places where every camera can see you." Isaiah stirred his oatmeal before answering. "People tend to remember what cameras remember." Leonard studied him carefully. "You planned that first day, did not you?" Isaiah smiled without confirming or denying the question. "Sometimes preparation looks exactly like surrender." Leonard leaned back, unable to decide whether the answer frustrated him or impressed him. Across the room, Cole noticed the exchange and whispered something to two members of his crew. They nodded before leaving the cafeteria separately instead of together. Isaiah watched their reflections in the cafeteria windows rather than turning his head. Every movement seemed intentional. Every glance appeared connected. The pattern growing around Cole was becoming easier to read. Later that morning, during work assignments, Correctional Officer Daniel Brooks received permission to examine several archived transfer documents stored in the administration basement. Dust covered many of the old filing boxes, but one folder labeled with Isaiah's inmate number contained records that had never been digitized. Most pages described routine transfers and educational certificates, yet one recommendation letter immediately stood out. It had been written years earlier by a prison psychologist. The final paragraph read that Isaiah possessed an exceptional ability to reduce tension among volatile populations and consistently chose restraint even when provoked. Daniel read the sentence twice before closing the folder. Nothing in the file resembled the dangerous image many inmates had already created around Isaiah. Instead, it described someone trusted to calm situations before they became crises. Daniel quietly wondered why such a man's previous career history remained sealed by federal request. Meanwhile, Isaiah spent the afternoon repairing damaged library shelves with a small maintenance crew. The assignment offered something far more valuable than privacy. It overlooked one of the main interior corridors connecting multiple housing units. While tightening loose screws and replacing warped boards, Isaiah casually observed correctional schedules, inmate movement, and delivery routes without appearing interested in any of them. He noticed that one surveillance camera briefly lost coverage whenever supply carts entered the corridor. More importantly, he noticed Cole's followers gathering near that blind spot several times throughout the afternoon. They never stayed long, but each visit lasted just long enough to exchange quiet words before walking away separately. Isaiah stored every detail without reacting. Near the end of the shift, the frightened young inmate from the recreation yard entered the library carrying returned books. His identification badge read Ethan Miller. He kept his eyes lowered while organizing the cart, clearly hoping to remain unnoticed. Isaiah walked over and handed him a book that had slipped onto the floor. "You dropped this," he said gently. Ethan accepted it with a nervous smile. "Thank you." Isaiah noticed the teenager's hands trembling slightly. "How long have you been here?" Ethan hesitated before answering. 3 months. Isaiah nodded. "That still feels new." Ethan looked surprised. "How did you know?" Isaiah's expression softened. "Because you still expect tomorrow to be different." Before Ethan could respond, another inmate called his name from the hallway, and he hurried away. Isaiah watched him disappear around the corner, recognizing the same uncertainty he had once seen in young men standing at crossroads that would define the rest of their lives. As evening approached, Daniel Brooks crossed paths with Isaiah during inmate movement back to the housing unit. Their eyes met briefly for the first time since the cafeteria incident. Daniel spoke quietly enough that no one else would hear. "You have an interesting file," Isaiah answered with the same calm tone he always used. "Files usually tell people what they expect to read." Daniel paused. "And what do they leave out?" Isaiah looked down the long corridor where Cole stood watching from a distance. "Usually the reason someone made the hardest choice of their life." The answer lingered long after Isaiah continued walking. Daniel turned to look toward Cole and then back toward Isaiah, sensing that both men were moving toward the same moment from completely different directions. Upstairs, Cole watched Isaiah disappear into the housing unit before giving a nearly invisible nod to one of his closest followers. Whatever happened next would not be another attempt to embarrass the quiet newcomer. Cole believed he had finally discovered the one pressure point capable of forcing Isaiah Grant to abandon the patience that had unsettled everyone inside Grayson from the very first day. The next afternoon unfolded exactly as Isaiah Grant had expected, although he wished it had not. Inside Grayson State Penitentiary, routines created the illusion of order, but beneath every schedule flowed invisible currents shaped by fear, loyalty, and quiet calculation. Isaiah reported to the recreation yard after lunch and immediately noticed that Ethan Miller was missing from his usual place near the benches. Instead, the young inmate stood alone beside the handball wall, surrounded not by friends, but by empty space that everyone else seemed determined to avoid. Cole Barrett had not touched him. He did not have to. Isolation could become its own prison long before anyone spoke a threatening word. Isaiah continued his slow walk around the perimeter without changing direction. He counted the cameras. He measured the distance between correctional officers. He noticed Officer Daniel Brooks standing near the entrance instead of his usual post along the fence. Daniel was watching more carefully than before. Something had changed inside him after reading Isaiah's file. Across the yard, Cole leaned against the basketball post with several members of his crew. They laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear, but their attention repeatedly shifted toward Ethan. Every few minutes another inmate approached the frightened young man only to leave moments later with an uncomfortable expression. Rumors traveled faster than facts inside prison walls, and Cole understood better than anyone how to weaponize uncertainty. Leonard Hayes quietly stepped beside Isaiah during the walking period. "People are saying the kid stole from the wrong people," Leonard murmured. Isaiah kept his eyes forward. "Do you believe it?" Leonard hesitated. "No, but belief does not matter much around here." Isaiah nodded. "It should." They completed another lap in silence. As Isaiah passed within several feet of Ethan, he noticed the young man's hands shaking again, even more noticeably than in the library. Ethan tried to avoid eye contact, but Isaiah slowed just enough to speak without drawing attention. "Keep breathing." Ethan looked confused. "What?" Isaiah offered a calm smile. "Fear wants you to rush. Do not let it decide for you." Before Ethan could answer, the recreation whistle signaled movement toward the indoor common area because an unexpected rainstorm had begun rolling across the prison grounds. Heavy clouds darkened the Indiana sky, and inmates filed inside under staff supervision. The common room quickly filled with scattered conversations, card games, and television noise. Isaiah deliberately selected a chair beneath another visible security camera. Daniel Brooks noticed the choice immediately. This was the fourth time Isaiah had positioned himself where surveillance could clearly document every interaction. Daniel finally understood that the pattern could not be accidental. Isaiah wanted witnesses, even if those witnesses were machines. Cole entered the room several minutes later, his confidence untouched by the weather. He crossed directly toward Ethan, stopping only a few feet away. The room gradually quieted. Everyone sensed another public test was beginning. Cole smiled in a way that appeared friendly to anyone who did not know him. "Heard you have been making new friends," he said. Ethan looked down at the floor without answering. Cole glanced toward Isaiah, who remained seated with a book resting unopened in his hands. "Funny thing about prison," Cole continued. "People who stand too close to the wrong person usually end up carrying the same problems." Isaiah slowly closed the book and looked at Cole with the same calm expression that had unsettled him since the first day. Sometimes the wrong person is simply the first one willing to help. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Cole expected hesitation, not quiet confidence. He took another step, hoping to provoke an emotional response, but Isaiah did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply remained exactly where every camera could see him. Daniel Brooks subtly shifted his position, allowing a clear line of sight between both men without interrupting the exchange. Cole studied Isaiah for several long seconds before laughing as though nothing important had happened. "You really think patience makes you strong?" he said. Isaiah answered almost gently. "No, patience only reveals who is already strong." The words landed differently than anyone expected. Several older inmates exchanged thoughtful glances. Even some of Cole's own followers looked uncertain. For the first time, the invisible balance inside Grayson seemed to shift, not because anyone had won an argument, but because someone had refused to play by the rules fear demanded. Later that evening, Daniel returned to the administration office and submitted a formal request for access to Isaiah's sealed federal records, fully expecting another denial. Instead, an automated response appeared within minutes. "Authorization pending. Additional review initiated." Daniel stared at the screen in disbelief. Someone outside Grayson still cared enough about Isaiah Grant to monitor inquiries into his past. At that same moment, Isaiah unfolded the worn photograph beneath his mattress once more. This time he looked not only at the smiling faces, but also at a handwritten sentence across the back. It read, "Protect the next one, no matter what it costs." Isaiah quietly traced the faded words with his thumb before placing the photograph back into its hiding place. Because after watching Ethan throughout the day, he knew with complete certainty who the next one was meant to be. The following morning began with a steady rain that painted narrow streams across the reinforced windows of Grayson State Penitentiary, turning the prison yard into a sheet of dull gray concrete that reflected both the guard towers and the heavy clouds above. Recreation was canceled, forcing everyone to remain inside the housing unit for extended indoor movement. And Isaiah Grant immediately understood that confined spaces often magnified decisions that would otherwise remain small. Men who normally spread across the yard were now gathered inside crowded corridors, card tables, and common rooms where every conversation overlapped with another. Cole Barrett welcomed the change. He preferred audiences that could not walk away. Isaiah noticed him moving through the housing unit with unusual purpose, stopping briefly beside different inmates before continuing without lingering long enough to attract official attention. It reminded Isaiah of a chess player quietly positioning pieces before making a move that everyone would believe happened by chance. Ethan Miller spent most of the morning organizing donated books inside the common room library, carefully avoiding eye contact with nearly everyone who entered. Isaiah volunteered to repair another loose bookshelf nearby, allowing him to remain within sight without making the protection obvious. Leonard Hayes eventually wandered over carrying a stack of worn paperbacks. "You really think the kid can make it through this place?" Leonard asked quietly. Isaiah tightened the final screw before answering. "People survive difficult places when someone reminds them they still have choices." Leonard looked toward Ethan. "He does not look like he believes that." Isaiah smiled gently. "Not yet." Across the room, Daniel Brooks observed the exchange while pretending to review inventory paperwork. Ever since requesting access to Isaiah's sealed records, he found himself noticing details that had escaped him before. Isaiah never inserted himself into conversations unless someone else needed encouragement. He never demanded attention, yet anxious inmates naturally drifted toward him. The effect was subtle, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once seen. Daniel had worked inside prisons for nearly 18 years, and he had rarely encountered someone capable of lowering tension simply by remaining calm. Later that afternoon, Daniel received a secure message from the Regional Corrections Office. His authorization request had been partially approved. Only a limited summary of Isaiah's protected background appeared on the screen, yet even those few lines reshaped everything Daniel thought he knew. Years before his conviction, Isaiah had served as a civilian instructor for a federally supported crisis intervention program that trained first responders, correctional professionals, and youth mentors in conflict de-escalation and protective restraint techniques. Several sections remained classified, while another portion had been permanently sealed by court order. Daniel read the summary again. The quiet inmate cleaning hallways and repairing shelves had once taught professionals how to prevent confrontations from becoming tragedies. Suddenly, Isaiah's unusual patience, constant awareness of surveillance cameras, and refusal to react emotionally formed a pattern that made perfect sense. Daniel closed the file slowly, wondering why a man with that history now carried a prison number instead of an instructor's badge. Before he could explore the question further, an announcement directed available officers toward the common room because a disagreement between several inmates was beginning to attract attention. By the time Daniel arrived, the voices had already quieted, but the atmosphere remained tense. Cole Barrett stood near one wall speaking with an easy smile, while Ethan remained frozen beside a table, clutching a library cart so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. Isaiah remained seated several feet away with a book resting on his lap, his posture relaxed but his attention unwavering. Daniel immediately noticed something important. Isaiah had deliberately positioned himself between Ethan and the nearest exit without appearing confrontational, creating a calm physical presence that discouraged escalation while leaving everyone enough space to choose a different direction. It was exactly the kind of positioning described in the federal training summary Daniel had just read. Cole glanced toward Isaiah and shook his head with a confident grin. "You really believe you can stand between everybody and their problems?" Isaiah closed the book carefully before replying. "No, I believe everyone deserves the chance to walk away from one." The room became unusually quiet. Even inmates pretending not to listen found themselves waiting for Cole's response. Instead of answering immediately, Cole simply smiled, though the confidence in that smile no longer looked effortless. For the first time since Isaiah had arrived, Cole seemed less interested in proving his authority than in understanding the man who refused to fear it. As evening count approached, Ethan quietly walked past Isaiah and whispered so softly that almost no one could hear, "Thank you for staying." Isaiah looked toward the young man with the same calm expression he had carried since entering Grayson. "One day," he answered, "you will stay for someone else." Ethan nodded, and for the first time since Isaiah had met him, the fear in the young inmate's eyes gave way to something far stronger than confidence. It was hope, fragile but unmistakable, and Isaiah understood that protecting a person rarely began with stopping harm. More often, it began by giving them a reason to believe they were not facing tomorrow alone. By the beginning of the second week, the atmosphere inside Grayson State Penitentiary had changed in ways that could not be measured on any official report. Nothing dramatic had happened. Yet conversations grew quieter whenever Isaiah Grant entered a room, not because people feared him, but because they had begun watching him with curiosity instead of judgment. Even inmates who had laughed during his first afternoon now found themselves questioning why a man with so much self-control had never once tried to prove himself. Cole Barrett noticed the shift before anyone else. Authority inside prison depended less on physical presence than on perception, and perception was slowly slipping beyond his control. That morning, he gathered several trusted followers near the unused maintenance corridor where one surveillance camera briefly lost coverage whenever supply carts passed through. Isaiah had already identified the blind spot days earlier, but this time he also noticed something different. Officer Daniel Brooks had quietly requested maintenance staff inspect the camera after reviewing several recent security reports. By noon, a portable recording unit had been installed facing the exact section that previously escaped observation. Daniel never mentioned the reason. He simply wanted every corner of the housing unit documented. Isaiah recognized the small camera immediately and understood that someone else had begun preparing for the same moment he had anticipated since arriving. During the afternoon work assignment, Ethan Miller approached Isaiah while returning library materials. His hands no longer trembled as noticeably as before, although uncertainty still lingered in his voice. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. Isaiah nodded. "Of course." Ethan hesitated for several seconds. "When people try to make you afraid, how do you stop being afraid?" Isaiah smiled gently. "You do not always stop." Ethan looked confused. Isaiah continued. "Real courage is making the next right decision while fear is still standing beside you." Ethan absorbed the words in silence. "Did somebody teach you that?" Isaiah looked through the library window where raindrops slowly slid down the glass. Someone I loved trusted me with that lesson many years ago. Before Ethan could ask another question, the afternoon movement whistle echoed through the corridor. Inmates began returning equipment, closing books, and forming orderly lines. Cole watched the exchange from across the room, his expression growing harder with every passing day. He no longer saw Isaiah as a quiet inmate refusing intimidation. He saw someone quietly changing the emotional balance of the entire housing unit without demanding loyalty from anyone. That was far more dangerous. Later that evening, Daniel Brooks finally received the remaining non-classified portion of Isaiah's background summary. Although many pages remained sealed, one incident report had been released for institutional review. Years earlier, Isaiah had received a national commendation after peacefully resolving a hostage crisis at a community youth center where frightened teenagers had been trapped during a volatile confrontation. The report emphasized that no unnecessary force had been used and credited Isaiah's patience, communication, and disciplined restraint with saving multiple lives. Daniel slowly lowered the document. The recommendation attached to the report ended with a handwritten sentence from a federal supervisor. Grant's greatest strength is convincing frightened people that they still have better choices. Daniel suddenly understood why Isaiah never responded to humiliation with anger. He had spent years teaching others that emotional control could protect lives. The prison had mistaken discipline for weakness. As lights dimmed across the housing unit, Leonard Hayes quietly climbed onto his lower bunk and looked toward Isaiah. "I have been thinking about something," he admitted. Isaiah looked down from the upper bunk. "What is that?" Leonard smiled faintly. "The first day, everyone thought Cole was testing you." Isaiah remained silent. Leonard continued, "Now I wonder if you were testing all of us." Isaiah considered the question before answering. People reveal themselves when they believe nobody is judging them. Leonard laughed softly. "And what did you learn?" Isaiah looked across the dark cell toward the narrow window where distant security lights reflected against the wet prison yard. "I learned there are more good people here than anyone realizes. They have simply forgotten what courage looks like." Several moments passed before Leonard spoke again. "Do you think that will change?" Isaiah answered without hesitation. "It already has." Down the corridor, Cole Barrett stood alone beside the second-floor railing, watching officers complete the evening count. His original plan had failed. Public humiliation had earned Isaiah respect instead of surrender. Isolation had only revealed Isaiah's compassion. Rumors had strengthened rather than weakened the quiet newcomer. For the first time in years, Cole accepted an uncomfortable truth. If he wanted to reclaim control over Grayson State Penitentiary, he would have to force Isaiah into a decision so public that every inmate would witness it together. Unaware that a newly installed camera now overlooked the very location he intended to use, Cole quietly finalized the plan that he believed would finally expose the real man hiding behind Isaiah Grant's endless patience. The morning of the prison inspection arrived beneath clear Indiana skies, bringing an unusual rhythm to Grayson State Penitentiary. Administrators walked the corridors with clipboards, supervisors reviewed procedures, and correctional officers checked equipment more carefully than usual. For most inmates, inspections changed nothing except schedules. For Cole Barrett, they created the perfect opportunity to stage one final public demonstration of control. With so many staff members focused on paperwork and logistics, he believed attention would drift just long enough for everyone inside the housing unit to witness Isaiah Grant finally lose the composure that had become impossible to explain. Isaiah sensed the difference before breakfast even began. Officers moved with greater urgency, yet Daniel Brooks remained unusually close to the housing unit instead of following the inspection team. Their eyes met briefly as inmates entered the dining hall. Daniel gave no visible signal, but Isaiah understood from his expression that something had changed. The additional camera installed near the maintenance corridor was operating continuously, and Daniel had personally confirmed its recording status before the morning count. Someone else, it seemed, was also waiting for truth instead of assumptions. After breakfast, inmates were directed toward the common activity room, while several hallways underwent routine inspection. The temporary change gathered far more people into one space than usual. Cole quietly smiled as he entered. This was exactly the audience he wanted. Ethan Miller stood near the back of the room, organizing returned books for the library cart. Leonard Hayes sat nearby, pretending to read an old magazine while discreetly watching every movement around him. Isaiah chose a chair beneath the corner security camera exactly as he always did, opened a worn paperback, and appeared completely uninterested in the restless atmosphere building around him. Cole walked slowly across the room until he stopped beside Ethan. "Looks like your bodyguard is busy reading today," he said with an easy grin that invited nervous laughter from several followers. Ethan remained silent, remembering Isaiah's advice to slow his breathing instead of reacting to fear. Cole looked toward Isaiah. "Still planning to solve every problem with speeches?" Isaiah calmly closed the book and placed it on the table. "No," he replied. "Only the problems that still have another answer." Cole laughed loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Then let us see how many answers you have left." He took another step, clearly expecting Isaiah to rise. Instead, Isaiah remained seated with both hands resting openly on the table where every nearby camera could clearly record them. Daniel Brooks quietly repositioned himself near the entrance, maintaining an unobstructed view of the entire room without interrupting the moment. Several inmates noticed the adjustment. Others noticed something else. Every path leading toward Ethan now crossed directly beneath the newly installed surveillance camera. Isaiah had chosen his seat with remarkable precision. Cole finally realized it as well. His confident smile faded for the first time. He slowly looked upward toward the small recording unit that had not existed only days earlier, then back toward Isaiah. The realization settled heavily across the room. Isaiah had never been avoiding confrontation because he lacked courage. He had been making certain that whenever the decisive moment arrived, every action, every choice, and every responsibility would be witnessed without question. The silence became almost overwhelming. Leonard quietly lowered his magazine. Ethan looked from Isaiah to Cole with growing disbelief. Daniel folded his arms, saying nothing. No one needed instructions. The room itself had become a witness. Cole attempted one final smile, but it no longer carried certainty. "You planned this," he said quietly. Isaiah answered with complete honesty. "I planned to give everyone the chance to choose differently." Those words landed more heavily than any accusation could have. Several members of Cole's own group exchanged uncertain glances before slowly taking a step backward, creating distance without being told. The invisible loyalty that had protected Cole for years began dissolving in absolute silence. Nobody wanted to stand beside the wrong decision once they understood every detail would be documented. Daniel watched the scene unfold with growing respect. The classified records had described Isaiah as a man who prevented conflict before it began. Now Daniel was watching that lesson unfold in real time. Isaiah had not defeated anyone. He had simply removed every excuse for making the wrong choice. Cole looked around the room searching for the confidence that had once followed him everywhere, but instead he found hesitation, lowered eyes, and quiet reflection. The authority he had built through intimidation had weakened not because someone challenged it with greater force, but because someone stronger had answered fear with discipline, patience, and undeniable transparency. As the inspection announcement echoed through the corridor, the moment quietly dissolved without anyone raising a voice. Yet everyone inside Grayson understood that something irreversible had happened. The prison no longer revolved around the loudest man in the room. It had begun listening to the calmest one. Several weeks passed after the inspection, and the change inside Grayson State Penitentiary became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Nothing dramatic appeared in the official reports. The daily schedules remained the same. The counts were completed on time. Meals arrived according to routine. Doors continued opening and closing with the same mechanical certainty they always had. Yet anyone who lived inside those walls understood that something fundamental had shifted. Cole Barrett still occupied the same cell and walked the same corridors, but the quiet certainty that once surrounded him had disappeared. Conversations no longer stopped because he entered a room. Inmates no longer looked toward him before making ordinary decisions. Fear had not vanished overnight, but it had lost its place as the strongest voice in the housing unit. Daniel Brooks noticed the difference every day during his rounds. Disagreements ended more quickly. Younger inmates began asking older prisoners for advice instead of choosing sides. The common room grew noticeably calmer. One afternoon, Daniel stopped outside the library where Isaiah Grant was repairing another shelf, while Ethan Miller sorted donated books nearby. "You know," Daniel said with a thoughtful smile, "the reports say disciplinary incidents have dropped since you arrived." Isaiah continued tightening a loose bracket before answering. "People usually solve more problems when they believe someone expects better from them." Daniel folded his arms. "I spent years believing order came from control." Isaiah looked up. "Real order comes from trust." Daniel considered the sentence for a long moment before quietly nodding. He finally understood why the federal records had described Isaiah as someone who changed environments without demanding authority. His greatest influence had never come from commanding people. It came from reminding them they still had a choice. Days later, Daniel received permission to speak with Isaiah privately regarding the sealed portions of his background. The meeting took place inside a small interview room with plain concrete walls and a single metal table. Daniel placed the approved summary between them. "I know about the crisis intervention program," he said. "I know you trained officers and community leaders. I know you helped resolve that youth center incident without anyone being seriously hurt." Isaiah listened quietly. Daniel hesitated before asking the question that had remained with him since the first day. Why did a man with that life end up here? Isaiah rested both hands on the table and looked toward the narrow window. "Because many years ago someone I cared about made one terrible mistake. He was barely older than Ethan. I believed he deserved the chance to rebuild his life instead of losing it forever. I accepted responsibility for decisions that should have been shared because I thought protecting him would give him a future." Daniel remained silent. Isaiah continued calmly. "He used that second chance well. He built a family, became a teacher, and never returned to the life that almost destroyed him. I have never regretted helping him become the man he was capable of being." Daniel slowly lowered his eyes. "And the photograph?" Isaiah smiled softly. "His family. They send me a new picture every year. The words on the back remind me why I made my choice." For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Daniel extended his hand across the table. Prison rules rarely encourage gestures like that, but some moments deserve humanity more than protocol. Isaiah accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude. News traveled quickly through the housing unit that Daniel Brooks had begun treating inmates with greater patience, listening before judging, and encouraging younger officers to solve conflicts through conversation whenever possible. Some colleagues questioned the change. Others quietly followed his example. Ethan Miller eventually earned a position assisting with educational programs, helping new arrivals learn prison routines without fear or confusion. Leonard Hayes often joked that Isaiah had somehow managed to rebuild an entire housing unit using nothing more than calm conversations and a toolbox. Isaiah always answered the same way. People rebuilt it themselves. They only needed someone to believe they could. On a warm autumn evening, Isaiah stood beside the narrow window of his cell watching orange sunlight settle across the prison yard. Ethan walked past below, laughing with several other inmates over an ordinary conversation that no longer carried the weight of constant fear. Daniel completed the evening count with relaxed confidence. Even Cole Barrett paused briefly at the railing, looking across the housing unit with a thoughtful expression that suggested he finally understood what power could never accomplish alone. Isaiah reached beneath his mattress and unfolded the familiar photograph one last time before placing it carefully inside a prison library book he planned to donate after his release someday. He smiled at the fading handwriting across the back that read, "Protect the next one, no matter what it costs," then quietly looked around the housing unit where frightened strangers had slowly become men willing to choose something better. Inside walls built to contain broken lives, the greatest victory had never been proving who was strongest. It had been proving that dignity, patience, and compassion could quietly outlast fear, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimated was the very one capable of changing an entire prison without ever raising his voice.